Shalom and welcome to this edition of Revealing the Truth, where we cover the headlines, the heartlines, and biblical truth. I'm your host, Messianic Rabbi Eric Walker. Dr. Michael Heiser is a scholar in the fields of biblical studies in the ancient Near East and is the executive director of the Awakening School of Ministry at Celebration Church in Jacksonville, Florida. He holds a PhD in Hebrew Bible and Semitic languages from the University of Wisconsin-Madison. He's the best-selling author of The Unseen Realms, Supernatural, Angels, Demons, What the Bible Really Says About the Powers of Darkness, Reversing Hermon, The World Turned Upside Down, The Gospel According to Stranger Things, and a companion guide to the Book of Enoch, Volumes 1 and 2. In addition, he hosts the Naked Bible podcast. You can find out more at drmsh.com. Joining us now is the author of one of my favorite statements, if it seems odd or strange in the Bible, it must be important, is Dr. Michael Heiser. Mike, so good to see you.
Yeah, good to see you again.
Mike, we did the last segment we did together, we did on I think we did when you were in the series on the Old Testament connections with Revelation, the book of Revelation. But since then, the companion to the book of Enoch, the Reader's Commentary, Volume 2, has come out. And the parables of the second vision of Enoch, and they're so profound, and so many people are unaware of the first century thinking of what were the influences, the literary influences, excuse me, and what were on the minds of the people of the time. And so little is really written about, there's the rejection because these books weren't canonized, but it's like books that are banned that people read and find out what was really going on and what was impacting the thought life. And we know in this Greco-Roman world that they were reading Socrates, and they were reading Plato, and they were reading Aristotle, and there was a great deal of assimilation going on, but there was still a mindset that just because the last prophet had spoken and written, that there was a period of complete silence and ignorance, and there was nothing being said, and it wasn't impacting anybody's teaching, and all they were holding on to is 400-year-old thought, hoping for the fulfillment of that, and that's just not the case. And so you've entered into the fray to say, in keeping with the rightful interpretation of Scripture and understand the context, we've got to fill in some blanks to understand the mindset of what a first century Jew was influenced by, not across the population, but by thought leaders and by scholars and by those who were standing against Jesus, some who were expecting Jesus. Could this actually be, these parables be the reason why Nicodemus had the chutzpah to step out? Because he was looking for something different than what the rabbis had architected as the prerequisites for the Messiah.
Yeah.
And so I wanted to talk to you today about this second vision, covering the parables of Enoch, Enoch 37 to 71, because they introduce us to some new thought that is consistent with the messianic prophecies of what we have canonized, what we have included in the Tanakh, and cannot be discounted because the wording of such is so specific that it cannot be ignored.
Yeah, I think the first thing that people in the audience need to realize is that You know, when you hear talk about the rabbis, we have to realize that's like talking about the Christians today. You know, how many varieties are there on that spectrum? And in the ancient world, in what we would call, again, the intertestamental Second Temple period, there wasn't just one view of basically anything. I mean, this is why, you know, you get later on, you get the rabbinic writings, you get the Midrash, you get the Talmud, where they're just tossing opinions back and forth. Well, that's the way things were. You know, there is no one mode of rabbinic thought about the Messiah. There is no one, you know, Jewish view. There's no one Judaism, okay, of the period. And that's actually important, because what you'll see, you know, out there on the, you know, the village atheist on the internet, you know, that's going to pick up a comment in some New Testament, you know, skeptic scholar's book about, oh, the New Testament presentation of Jesus as Messiah, that just doesn't conform to, you know, to how Jews thought about the Messiah. Well, okay, it doesn't really conform to the way a lot of Jews thought about Messiah, but it actually does conform to the way some Jews thought about Messiah. You know, that the New Testament is writing a stream of interpretation and tradition, of, you know, exegetical insight into the Hebrew Bible, the Tanakh, that was known at the time. In other words, the New Testament writers aren't just making anything up. You know, Constantine didn't decide 300 years later, you know, what, you know, this or that thought about Jesus. It's absolutely absurd. And it really shows a complete lack of knowledge of the material of the intertestamental period to say things like that, which is typically why you'll get it on Facebook, you know, or some website somewhere, or the History Channel or whatever. You know, and Enoch is really important, and specifically the parables, because in this section, 37 through 71, this is where, instead of the Watcher story, the Genesis 6 stuff, that takes center stage in the Book of the Watchers, the first 36 chapters. That is not center stage in 37 through 71, even though it gets referenced. But what is center stage is the Messiah. So you get, you know, a stream of Jewish thought and messianic expectation in 1 Enoch 37 to 71 that is remarkably, and I would say in some cases compellingly, consistent with how Jesus is presented in the New Testament. Now, you know, obviously there are differences, because this is pre-Jesus. There's a reference to the Parthians in this section, a Parthian war, which allows scholars to basically date this at, you know, 40 BC on into the first century. And the Gospels aren't going to be written until, you know, let's just assume Mark is the earliest, you know, in the 60s or whatever. So this is in existence prior to the New Testament presentation of Jesus, especially a gospel like John that focuses on the deity. You know, what you get here is you get this notion, this messianic profile that is really startlingly like certain things you see about Jesus. Now, the Messiah figure is important in the section because the Messiah is presented as the apocalyptic judge. Your listeners might recall when we talked a little bit about this section of Enoch before, that the middle section, the parables, is about what happens at the final judgment. You know, if you go back to the very beginning of Enoch, it's an apocalypse. It basically says you're doomed, you know, judgment is coming. And the rationale for why is human depravity, and that's the connection back to the Watcher episode, which is why they spend so much time on it, justifying, you know, the judgment to come based on human depravity. But when you get the Messiah presented as judge, the wicked aren't judged because they've rejected the atoning work of the Messiah. We haven't had that yet. This is pre-Jesus. They are rather, you know, rejected on other points of Torah, Tanakh, unrighteousness and wickedness. So that's a major difference, but what's said about the figure is remarkably similar to the kinds of things that are said about Jesus. And we can drill down into some of those if you like.
Well, we're introduced to this in different from the first part, this part told us more about a vision of heaven and a mysterious figure called the elect one.
Mm-hmm.
And angels were also mentioned, but it's rarer than the previous book.
Right.
The elect one is more important than the angels, and that kind of is a little bit of a shift. And he introduces that he receives 3 parables from God. And in these parables, the first one opened by a statement about the end fate of righteousness and unrighteous people. But God's glory will be imparted into his holy people so that our face will shine. So this is that light, that Shekinah glory, that glorified body, if you will. And then he talks about 4 of God's archangels by name. Mm-hmm. Michael, Raphael, Gabriel, and Phanuel. And so he's talking about the mansions of the elect in heaven. We don't read about mansions until Jesus says, in my Father's house are many mansions, many rooms. And so it's so confirming because it's a complete parallel of John 14:2. Mm-hmm. So was the influence in a parable becoming adopted into the teaching, or was there a revelation to Enoch and a revelation to Jesus, and being consistent and in the same quote-unquote vernacular, does that actually confirm the authenticity? And then the question becomes, were the first part of Enoch, are there different authors? Is this still the same Enoch who wrote the first part? And that question's come up because the style is different. It's moving from one approach to a shift.
Yeah, and this section is one of the things that gives rise to that question. Probably the most noticeable difference is in the first 36 chapters, the offending celestial beings before the flood are referred to as watchers. In the parables section, when those events are referenced, the word watcher is not used. Rather, it's angels, like evil angels, angels that sinned, or something like that. Again, which obviously is more New Testament vocabulary, referencing the same thing. So, on the one hand, thematically it's consistent, but like you said, you have these apparent authorial distinctions. Plus again the emphasis on Messiah, which I wouldn't say it comes out of the blue, because you've got this notion that the wicked are going to be judged. This is again Hebrew Bible sort of thinking about the Lord Himself arriving on the scene in the day of the. I mean, there are threads of this already in sort of the Jewish consciousness. But when you get the emphasis, again, that's another thing that makes people wonder: do we have a different author here? And we may well. It's just like, it's like the Bible. It's not one authorial hand. This is a collection of literature of pieces of writing that we call First Enoch. I mean, it eventually gets that name because the content, regardless of where it is Enochian. In other words, it tracks on, well, the reason for the judgment are the angels that sinned or the watchers of the flood. The proliferation of depravity. In other words, you have these big themes that are consistent throughout the book, and so this is why, at some point in antiquity, this literature sort of became viewed as a collection or body of knowledge that reflected, again, a particular perspective that was consistent. And it's not the only stuff that does that. I mean, you have other texts from Qumran that do it. Book of the Giants, the Genesis Apocryphon. It's not like the only Jews thinking this stuff are those wacky people living out at Qumran. No, that isn't true. It's wider than that. But as far as what we know as First Enoch, it apparently is a collection by more than one hand, but it's consistent in terms of its content.
Is when we look at this and its attribute to Enoch, of course, Enoch did not know death. He walked with God and he was no more. Is this an example of thousands of years later, we get this manna from heaven from someone who has been obviously in the presence of the divine council, who has been in the presence of paradise, of God and how he operates, and in knowledge of the angels, would have been conversant with them. Is this a like the earliest prophetic piece of literature that we have coming directly down from heaven, not in the form of the Nevi'im, the prophets that were contemporary messengers of God in context to the kings and to the circumstances, but is this like all right, listen, I've been up here for a couple thousand years. I want to share with you a summation of my observations and my understanding of how things are going to play out, almost as kind of like an early warning system that, because we know where he is, where he's been, and then all of a sudden these writings appear, and where do they come from? They come from heaven. They are divinely inspired, not deity, but divinely inspired, based on things that we can pinpoint actually did occur at later times, were fulfilled, and almost in the same wording as they were revealed to the writers of the New Testament. So
Yeah.
how do we set that up, that we finally hear from a character who prior to Noah, prior to the flood, is giving us some kind of insight, and not in a descending from heaven, because Scripture tells us no one has ascended and descended but the Son of Man. So, but how do we get a hold of this after thousands of years of him being with the Lord?
Yeah, this is a question that involves a distinction between sort of the physical content, i.e. the book itself, and the perception of Enoch. So those are two related but different things. So in terms of what we actually have, we have manuscripts that go back to probably 300, 250 BC. We don't have, even in the book, Enoch doesn't claim to be sort of channeling the book, but there's obviously first-person language and so on and so forth. There's no way you can't really affirm that the book is sort of handed from heaven and then deny its canonicity, which the Jewish community did, other than the people at Qumran. But that takes us into the perception, and this actually was a debate in the Second Temple period, sort of pitting Enoch against Moses. And it's not in the sense that they were enemies, but the question was, who had more spiritual authority? And there were those that, because you have the main character Enoch, not only in this book but in some other material, they certainly believed that Enoch had been taken by the Lord to heaven, so he has this direct access, so on and so forth. And so surely that must mean something. So when we get Enochian material, which again, at least the people at Qumran thought was in the prophetic stream, okay, the stream of inspiration, for them this was better information. It trumped the law, not because Moses was bad or or not as smart, but it's because Enoch walked with God. There's all these biblical themes, okay? And so you will actually, this is actually sort of a thing that scholars of the period kind of track on and try to do something with. The attitude of the people who sort of followed Enochian thought versus the Pharisees, we'll say, who were just dedicated to Moses. So you actually do have different sides taken. I mean, they're all going to be Jews living during the same period, but doctrinally they went off in different trajectories because of this distinction, the person of Enoch versus the person of Moses. And it does lead, to some interesting, places. This isn't one of them, but a more familiar example would be the disagreement of the Pharisees and the Sadducees over the resurrection. That comes up in the Gospels. I mean, there were these divergences of doctrine within Second Temple Judaism, and if you had the Enochians again versus the Pharisees, you're going to have different approaches, different doctrinal perspectives to these things. And the Pharisees could gripe all they want, but the Enochians would say, look, we're not saying Moses was just a bad guy. We're just saying that Enoch is better. I mean, now, from our perspective, people who actually look at this stuff, it's really interesting how Enoch becomes a theological mirror or counterpart to certain things, and a typology of certain things. Now he certainly is a type in the New Testament in 1 Peter 3, so that's included in the New Testament, but the way Enoch is talked about in wider Second Temple material that's not Christian, he becomes the seventh. He is the seventh from Adam, so he becomes the counterpart to the Mesopotamian seventh from Adam, manmade or Enki, and that has theological ramifications. What Enoch says we should follow, not what Babel says, because they have their own version of divine knowledge dispensed to a human in like real-time contact. But this is not what's going on, and this is. Even in that's part of the Genesis genealogies and the Sumerian king list. You get this mirroring trade-off. It's part of a bigger one, because in the Sumerian king list they're all kings. Okay, that isn't the case in Genesis 5. Nobody's a king there. They're tracing clans, and so it becomes a polemic against kingship. It becomes a polemic specifically against Babylon and their kingship and their empire. And it hinges on Enoch. He's 365 years old. Enmed or Enki in Mesopotamia was associated with the Babylonian sun god. Well, 365 is the solar, year. And so for Jews, it's like, no, we're not doing the Babylonian astronomical stuff. We think that the God of Israel is the one who created the heavens. And if we're going to know anything about what's going on up there, we're going to get it through Enoch. This is the kind of thinking, the way this plays out theologically. He becomes a really important figure for reject this and go this direction in the Jewish mind. And some of that, like I said before, finds its way into the New Testament in different ways. And so the New Testament is going to be picking up, parts of that stream. But Enoch is, again, he's not a counter Moses, but he's a competitor. It's kind of like, if we use the boxing analogy, it's like the number one and number two contenders, which one is really number one, which one is really number two. So that was actually a discussion, and for academics it still is. You look back on the material, it's just kind of interesting. And like in Galatians 3, the whole Galatians 3:19 thing, the law was added because of transgressions. Well, if you take an Enochian view, the plural is important. It's not just the one transgression of Adam, it's the transgressions plural of the watchers. And then that begins a whole discussion of how the law was meant to retard or inhibit human depravity, and human depravity is to blame back on this event. Well, that's a whole other thought trajectory than what we're used to, because we're used to to thinking about, the Pharisees and the rabbinic, tradition, the quote unquote normal, way of looking at this. But there were a number of Jews that thought, no, this, Paul would have been in the Enochian stream there. It's really kind of interesting. You get these things, and the reference to because of the angels, in 1 Corinthians 11. I mean, Paul wades into this stream a few times, and so does Peter, in 1 Peter 3.
The argument about Moses, obviously Moses said, one would come after me, you're to follow him and do what he tells you, or you'll be cut off from your people. I've always felt that to be the two words that were compelling to Peter and to Matthew, that they heard the word follow me. They equated it to Moses' proclamation. No other prophet ever said follow me. So
it's coherent because Jesus is the new Moses, but he's also he's the new and better Moses, and he's the new and better Enoch. It just depends where you're at in the New Testament.
Right, but I would lean towards, because these are much more specific, more in the line of a combined Ezekiel-Isaiah kind of commentator, and then adding the revelation of John, the knowledge of the Jews becoming a light to the Gentiles. There's so much more here that bridges the gap, that says that God loved the world, that this was a system he set up, and that this elect one was going to come fulfill these things. This was much more complete than even the Isaiah 53 description, much more complete than anyone foretold, although the psalmist, the increase of the government shall be upon a certain thing. But this was much more in these parables, a clearer picture of the coming conflict of Enoch 45:4, he will raise up the kings and the mighty seal from their seats and break the teeth of the sinners. Mm-hmm. This is foretelling of the campaign of Armageddon. This is foretelling of when good and evil collide, and the Messiah is going to rise up to conquer. All who dwell on earth shall fall down and worship him. Every knee shall bend and every tongue shall profess that Jesus is Lord. These are as much synonyms for exactly what was written in the New Testament as quoted by, just paraphrased, and we can see the parallels. So it seems that the timing of your investigation into this and the revelation, because so little had been written on it, is clearly a bridge to an understanding of the revelation that, one, to the Jewish world, the elect one was going to come in their day and age. And so the prophecy of Daniel that the anointed one would be cut off before the destruction of the second temple, the timing is such that this would prepare for that scenario.
Yeah, there were lots of competing calendars, as you know. Pharisees had one, Sadducees had one, basically every group had one. But it's interesting that the Enochian system, which had a very specific, the 364-day calendar and all that, was the only one, because it had this idea of 100 jubilees in this 4,900 span. It was the only one that actually sort of had a workable window in which the Messiah would come, where Jesus actually falls. And that, again, that's, I know we've had this conversation a little bit before, but that's one of the reasons why some scholars today wonder. I mean, there are other reasons, and the Messiah profile is yet another one. But it's one of the reasons why scholars wonder if people who were at Qumran, Essenes, or again, that's still the best guess, who were very much into this Enochian thought mode when Jesus actually shows up. Again, the right time, doing the right thing, saying the right thing, that they actually became followers. They became believers, followers of Jesus, because he so well fit these elements of their profile. And I think that's a legitimate possibility. I mean, there's just a lot. I mean, if I were sitting there at Qumran and I had all this stuff floating around in my head, and I start hearing about this guy Jesus, and you kind of get a little backstory, like, how old's the guy? Okay, let's do the math. And there are just things like that it would be hard for me to sit there and think, we were wrong. Like, it can't be this. We still got to wait. You can't be this. I mean, I would be predisposed to thinking, well, gosh, I better go hear this guy, because it's starting to look like we were right, and so you'd be attracted, to Jesus for that reason. Then when you went and heard him and saw the miracles, it's like, okay, what else do we need here? It would be very hard to not go down that road. Now, for your audience, you're using the phrase "elect one," and that is one of several titles in Enoch. I think it's important for people to realize that in Second Temple Jewish literature, you would be hard pressed to find a resource, i.e., a book, that collects more messianic titles or phrases than this one. Okay, I mean, Enoch basically has them all. We've got elect one, we've got anointed one, that's the one everybody knows, Mashiach. We've got righteous one, the righteous branch. We've got Son of Man, which is actually the one that's used most. So there's another one. If I'm sitting at Qumran, and not only is this guy born at the right time and he's doing miracles, and but he refers to himself over and over and over again as the Son of Man. I'm like, when's my day off? I'm going into the city. I gotta see this guy. It would be really hard to not find that compelling.
With what we know today, what we found in the Dead Sea Scrolls, what we've found in this intertestamental literature, is there any effort, or has there been any effort, to review the canonization process that was used at the time to determine what was to be included and not included, and review, based on what we know today and our deeper understanding of the unseen realm, a deeper understanding of more emphasis on certain writings than on others? Has there been any group that has said it's time to relook at what is canonized scripture, and we need to kind of...
Other than the Gnostics, no. I mean, the Protestants aren't doing this. The Roman Catholics aren't doing this. The serious Jewish community is not doing this. You have people who are let's call them, you got serious Gnostics and you've got the celebrity internet Gnostic. Okay, they're all over it because of Dan Brown. We want this, all that thrown in the mix here, and Constantine made the cat. But I don't really count them, because just overall that's not really a serious group. But everyone else is just sort of going with what's there. Again, my position is that, look, just read the stuff. A book doesn't have to be canonical to be useful. You should read what New Testament writers read and reference. You should get acquainted, again, we're talking about stream of tradition with Enochian tradition, because you will find it in the New Testament. The more you know of it, the more capably you can see it and pick it out when it does show up in the New Testament. In scholarship, I can say this isn't the canon question, But there have been a couple of books published recently. For instance, one is edited by Stuckenbrook and I think Boccaccini, who's the other big Enoch scholar, going through the Gospels and marking allusions, like discussing the four Gospels and their relationship to the Book of Enoch. Now, I don't know if there's a plan to do that with the rest of the New Testament or not. There may be. There have been a couple dissertations that have done that, like Tyler Stewart's on Galatians 3 and things like that. So you are getting in the academy more attention specifically to Enochian material as it relates to the New Testament. I tend to think that's part of a reflex of just generally in the last 20, 25 years of reassessing the way we do New Testament interpretation. We're not, instead of looking forward to the rabbinics, the late, late antiquity, early modern, medieval period. Let's pay more attention to Second Temple literature. That is absolutely a trend within the academy, and as more people are trained, it's gonna seep down, into the popular consciousness. But as far as the canon issue, other than that extreme example, I've not heard a peep about doing that.
Well, you can't get anybody to agree on anything, but it just seems that this was such an influential piece. I can understand the Maccabees not being, but it's an important historical document to set the setting for some of the changes that took place during the Hellenistic period, such as the appointment of the priest as opposed to the lineage of the priesthood, and that carries all the way through Annas and Caiaphas.
I have to confess, I would be opposed to reopening the canon issue. I think of it like when I hear suggestions about a constitutional convention. Like for the first things you think, oh, that would be an interesting idea. It'd be fascinating. Boy, when some good had come out, and then it's like, oh, you're like, who's in charge of that?
Right.
It just like torpedoes the whole idea. So that's kind of the bucket that gets piled in.
Yeah, and certainly that makes sense because there's who gets to pick them? Well, I want to be I want to be the one that picks the people on the panel.
Right.
Okay,
Yeah,
so I give you a vote, and I want you on it, and
you're gonna have somebody from the Urantia Foundation.
Yeah, exactly. And so there's enough people shooting at me. This is like be a whole brand new target, and you go to shooting ranges around the country, and all of a sudden there's me. Maybe churches will start to put in shooting ranges and put in.
Nobody's stopping you from reading it and studying it and things like that. So I think we're okay.
Well, what's interesting is that you've given us the tools, and that's what I think is most important. Is that people have heard, but they just discount them because they weren't canonized. Well, if they had a guide like you've invested in, and there are some other source documents out there that harvest some very good points, summations of certain chapters, but then the connecting it all is what's so vitally important, and that's what you and I have always done, is that in context, here's what it was, here's what is being said. Okay, now, is there a 21st century application to it? Not always. Some things are one and done. The Babylonian captivity was foretold. It was done. It was finished. The walls were rebuilt. It's over. It's not a contemporary prophecy. It was a prophecy for that time. It was completed. About 2,500 prophecies in the Bible, about 2,000 already fulfilled. So it's not always a future look. It's some things are finished, within the time frame in which they're given.
Mm-hmm.
They're done. Okay? Now I can learn and glean from it, but then I can look forward to other things. I think each one of us, regardless of what we have been taught, must determine for ourselves, does Jesus fulfill that which is defined to us? Did he come into Jerusalem on the 10th of Nisan? Was he slaughtered at the hour of the Passover lamb? If he wasn't, then he wasn't the Lamb of God. Those kind of time frame, not Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, 10th day, 14th day, 15th day, references of God in God's timing. Okay? If he wasn't that, then he wasn't it. And that's
yeah. As that pertains to Enoch, again, Enoch, all the attention falls on the Book of the Watchers, because of the Genesis 6 thing. But I would encourage people who are listening to this, if you're going to get familiar with one passage in First Enoch that has apologetic value as far as Messiah goes, I would go to chapter 48, First Enoch 48, because again, just put me to the test here. Every Easter, every Christmas, again, you're going to get again the shows on Netflix or the Impulse Shelf magazine that's going to try to separate the Jesus of history from the Christ of faith, like they're two different things, and all this Christology stuff. Jesus is God and pre-existent. That was all made up by the church, and this poor historical peasant, has all this stuff piled on him, and no, go to First Enoch 48, and you're going to read. I'm just going to read. This is from the old Charles translation, so it's public domain. In that place again, Enoch is narrating this, I saw the fountain of righteousness, which was inexhaustible, and around it were many fountains of wisdom, and all the thirsty drank of them, and were filled with wisdom. And their dwellings were with the righteous and holy and elect. And at that hour, the Son of Man was named. Okay, so he gets, you're the Son of Man. Okay, in the presence of the Lord of Spirits, and his name, was before the head of days, so the Ancient of Days thing. So there's this ceremony. It sounds a lot like Daniel 7, where the Son of Man is given the status of preeminence. Now catch this. Yea, before the sun and the signs were created, before the stars of heaven were made, his name was named before the Lord of Spirits. This is pre-existence. Okay? Right there it is, of the Son of Man. This is a Jewish text. Okay, this isn't some Christian, later on. So to me, this whole notion, and that's just one example. There are several in Enoch where you get specific elements of the messianic profile. This shows you that a Jew living before Jesus expected the messianic Son of Man to be God. Okay, this is the only figure that fits this. This is before creation. So that you can't run around and you shouldn't be running around and listening to the History Channel or Bart Ehrman or whatever, making these claims about how all this is a late invention. It's not. It's right here. It's in this text and others. I mean, if for no other reason, you should be acquainted with this kind of material just as a rebuttal, a stopgap against this kind of thinking it really is put into the public arena through magazines and TV shows to undermine, people's faith. You should know that it's not the case. It's not true.
The most compelling part of the parables to me was in that same chapter, that he'll be a light to the Gentiles and a hope for those who are troubled at heart.
Verse 4, right there it is.
Okay.
Yeah.
All who dwell on earth shall fall down and worship him.
Mm-hmm.
In the day of judgment, the earth and Sheol and hell will give back all dead people, and the elect one will choose the righteous and holy from among the dead. Okay.
It sounds suspiciously like the New Testament.
This is before any of the New Testament writings, in a summation, people want to know what the Jewish thought was. And when we hear Jesus say, I only do what I saw my Father do, I only heard, I said what I heard my Father say, and you have this transitional document, we have the Tanakh, which is a direct quotations. We can take all, everything Jesus said, and we can draw a line and connect with where he doesn't nullify, he clarifies. It's not the same words, it's not the nullification, it's the clarification of everything that's contained in here. All 613 commands, pretty much clarified, not nullified. But then you have this kind of wording. And this kind of wording is before the Second Temple period. This kind of wording is not influenced by anything within the Greco-Roman influences of philosophy. It doesn't reflect a narrative of, of assimilation. It's not philosophical. It is intrinsically biblical and divinely inspired, based on, if our belief system is that all Scripture is true, based on an eyewitness to the plans of the Father, and giving us a foreshadowing of, here's some of the highlights, here's a highlight reel of what's to come.
Yeah, you get New Testament, when the New Testament is in this stream again, using that metaphor, or, if the New Testament follows these paths and it includes, this kind of language, it does validate that, okay, here's, you guys ought to know this, okay, because of this earlier thing, it's a validation of the content. Again, regardless of the community status, i.e. the canonical status of this, again, I think your audience will understand when I say this, but it doesn't really matter. The canon question doesn't really matter. It's the content question, okay, that's really compelling here. That you can get, again, somebody in this community, Jewish, we're looking for the Messiah, right down the line, and here this is their understanding. I mean, even the last line of 48 says, it talks about the wicked are going to be punished, for they have denied the Lord of spirits and his anointed. And again, we don't have an atoning work yet, because this is pre-cross and all that, but it's like, if this guy is who we think he is, and again, and you have a knowledge of Enoch, you cannot reject it. You cannot be, in right relationship with God and reject his Messiah. I mean, just that much is something that, at the time, even if they don't anticipate what's going to happen, this is where our loyalty needs to be, right here. Right here. And, it's just, this is why the material has value. I did an interview a couple of days ago, and I always get the question, why should we bother, reading this stuff and blah, 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 blah. And it's like, okay, just throw it all away, throw it out of your head, and now go watch the History Channel. It just, because you're basically sitting ducks to the kind of claim that this is all new and invented. It's a bunch of church guys in a smoke-filled room in the 3rd or 4th century. No, it isn't. It really isn't. It's consistent, and its consistency is compelling. Okay, there's nothing else like it. It's not that the Tanakh and what it said about Messiah, that didn't get forgotten. Okay, people are thinking about it and looking for it and anticipating it, and they're connecting the dots, they're studying it, they're writing, and some of them just, bang, 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 bang. I mean, they just get it. they get it, and it connects again with the New Testament. Again, that's a compelling thing over thousands of years to have this kind of track record and roadmap. You know, it isn't contrived. It's not just getting lucky.
if you frame this in the fact that Enoch is taken up and he is in, they didn't park him in a different zip code. So he wasn't separated from, he had conversations, he had insights, he had observations. Whether or not he was on the inside in or on the outside in, we have no idea. But nevertheless, he knew the structure of heaven, he knew the words of Messiah, he knew what God was saying and planning and discussing, and is now kind of giving us an insider's view of what is to come. I think its authenticity is the fact that God ordained the release of this in a period of time when he wasn't sending his direct messengers to bring his words, but was laying the foundation of understanding, saying, here's the continuity. Here's what I want you to focus on. Here's where your attentions need to be. You're going to be in a state of turmoil, but I'm going to tell you that in this turmoil, what's going to come out of this is going to be one who's going to bring you wisdom, knowledge, and understanding, and he's the one to pay attention to. There's going to be the watchers. There's going to be this supernatural demonic, but one is going to come with authority over this, higher than the angels, and I've got the angels advising and giving counsel to the one I'm sending these writings to. It's hard for me to conceive of who the scribe was who compiled this. That's kind of one of those question marks of, did he come back down to write it and then go back up? Well, it doesn't say. We don't know. Don't know how we got it, but we got it. Inspiration.
You would think if you're a Jew living in the Second Temple period, and you know that, okay, we may not really be able to figure out how all this is going to turn out, but we have to assume that God will, help us see. In other words, there's going to be a way station somewhere that will inform us as to what, as to how it worked, and we have to assume that the Spirit of God is going to providentially work so that when it is starting to play out, he's going to direct our attention. If we're seeking him, and this is the whole Hebrews 11 thing, that God rewards those who seek him. We have to assume that God hasn't lost interest, and he's going to, again, help us seek him. Just that little seed thought, and again, if you're the person boots on the ground in the first century, and you start, I'm assuming this of literate Jews, okay, and you start hearing about Jesus and so on and so forth, it's a mistaken idea to think that everybody thought like the Pharisees. You're going to have people in the crowd that go, yeah, I know why the Pharisees don't like this, but you know what? There's this other group over here that they're starting to look pretty smart. There's a lot to be said here for the way they parsed the Hebrew Bible, the way they parsed the Word of God for us. And again, that you can see how someone could think the Lord is directing us here.
Right, this is the same 400 years that we were enslaved in Israel that we didn't hear from the Lord.
Yeah.
And it's the same 400-year period, all right, and then God sends Moses, all right, to lead us out. God's sending one to lead us out. The timing is the same, 400 years. All right. The passage in Exodus tells us that God remembered Israel. Well, again, God is remembering that listen, the people have been floundering for a while, and they've been influenced, and they've assimilated into this Greco-Roman culture. And in order to pull them out of this, or at least give them a lifeline, I'm going to give them some words which will be the same as I did with Moses, which was not an easy thing to accept after 400 years of crying out and thinking God doesn't hear you. Well, here's that same window period, 400-year intertestamental period. Somewhere in there, God sends another word to his people who are floundering, looking, searching, and not hearing from the prophets. And now he gives them another word, and it kind of is analogous to that, saying that before you fall into complete depravity and take on the identity of your captors and Stockholm syndrome and all the things that you're prone to do because you like their women and you like it because it feels good, I'm going to throw in this text, and it's going to be a wake-up call to you to look back, turn up, and look back and see that what I'm about to tell you is going to come to play.
I can't prove what I'm about to say here, but it is interesting that if you take 490, okay, and let's use 1000 BC. Okay, now we're trickling into the time of David. Okay, the Davidic kingdom. You go back, and it's Moses is born by biblical chronology in 1525. You take 40, off that, and it's 1485. So again, you're 485, 490. You're in the time of David. Then, if you press it to Solomon, or you just basically, if you do this 490 thing, like roughly 500 years, you wind up having these really important figures, whether it be Zerubbabel, or in this case, again, you have, the content of the Book of Enoch and the Septuagint. Okay, let's not forget the Septuagint.
Right.
So, you do have this sort of numerical patterning. And it's not like it wasn't prophesied specifically anywhere, but to the Essene, these are like, again, part of the 490-year thing with 100. They're tracking on this idea, so we can look back and sort of see that it's kind of interesting. And if you're in this system, this is what you're looking for. I mean, you're going to be tracking on it.
Always fascinating. You and I always uncover some new thoughts, provoke each other to want to know more, because there's so much more to know. And unfortunately, we've gone way over today, and I don't care. Next time you and I will talk will be in June on the radio. So I don't get to say my great big goodbye to you, because I'm going to be continuing discussion with you through another medium. But I want to thank you for the personal contribution you've made to me, to this program. We did what God asked us to do. We put out 2,100 deep, probative episodes of just a phenomenal 4.5 years of intense content production, and introduced the world to concepts that they had never conceived of before, and know that many, many eyes were opened, and that I know that in 2015 the unseen realm was the life changer for me in my walk, that really spring-pulled me to really understanding and going on a deep dive where I could actually hold a conversation with you. Your interest and dialogue for the last 4 years has been a complete and total blessing to me. And so I thank you for your friendship, and I thank you for your contribution, and I thank you for who you are, and glad we got to see what I consider to be the best of Mike Heiser. So thank you.
Well, you're welcome, and trust me when I say I've been stimulated to think as well. So it's been fun, and I think useful. Not only just for the audience, but for me too. So I'm glad that we were able to do these.
Well, we will continue in one form or fashion, because this isn't the And it's just the closing of one chapter and the beginning of another.
Great. Thank you.
God bless you, my friend. We're going to take a short break, and when we come back, we'll bring you the next edition of Revealing the Truth.